Thank you for joining us today for the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice Chair Chat. These chats are an opportunity to engage directly on timely issues in civil rights and social justice, explore perspectives from our expert panelists, and spark discussions that hopefully inspire action. My name is Malia Brink. I'm a council member at the ABA section on civil rights and social justice. I'm joined today by two esteemed ABA members and advocates, John Dacey and Robert Craig, who are respectively Executive Director and Associate Director of Abolish Private Prisons. Abolish Private Prisons is a nonprofit organization that's mission is to end the use of private prisons in the United States. Today, we're going to talk a little about the history of private prisons in the US, the ABA's policies in opposition to private prisons, and what members can do to help move their jurisdiction away from the use of private prisons. So let's just jump in and ask just a very foundational question. Can one of you explain briefly why private prisons are problematic?
Yeah, of course. And thank you for having us. I think when we think about private prisons and why they're problematic, we see them along a couple different spectrum, right? The first one is it's a moral issue, moral and ethical issue. We think it's just plain wrong that there is a corporation and a person that is profiting off of the detention of somebody else, right? There's just some things that only government should be able to do. And we think one of those things is incarceration to the extent that incarceration is necessary. And so there's just a moral problem when you turn the control and the dominion of a person over to somebody else. And then that gets amplified when that person has a profit motive to set up the situations that person's being detained in, right? And that leads into the next axis that we think, shows the wrongness of private prisons and what are some of the problems, the profit motive itself, right? You see how the profit motive affects the jailer's decisions. And this can mean everything to how they design the prison, how they operate the prison, and all of the small day-to-day decisions that go into, running and operating one of these facilities. There's been some evidence that suggests that if you're in a private prison, you're more likely to be written up for disciplinary infractions. And that just feeds in, it's sort of an actual example of the theory that is just sort of obvious, right? If you're running a private prison, you're going to want people to stay there. What's one way you can do that? Well, you can make sure that they're getting disciplinary infractions so that they don't get things like good time off their credits, good time credits off their time. And, that varies state to state, but the fact is that when you have the profit motive to operate one of these prisons, you're more likely to run it in a way that benefits your own profit motive to the detriment of the people that are being incarcerated there. And so we think that there's sort of the moral issue, there's the sort of profit-driven incentives problem. We also think that if you put it historically into context, it is the latest incarnation of slavery in the United States, right? You have chattel slavery that was operating in the United States until the Civil War. After the Civil War, particularly in the Reconstruction states, you have this convict leasing system where many of the people who were being held in slavery were then being convicted of these, very low level, sometimes made up crimes and being leased back to the same plantations where they had been previously held just a few years ago. And then as that system sort of waned, then you see the implementation of these very punitive incarceration statutes. And as that got privatized, now you're seeing the same kind of issue where these over-policed communities are being held for the profit of another party. And as is usual, it's an already, powerful party in the United States. And there's also constitutional problems, we think, with private parties operating these facilities. That may be out of the scope to get deep into the constitutional issues, but we think that there's just many, many issues that come up when you start to hold somebody in incarceration or detention for the profit of somebody else.
Thank you. Let's start. I want to pick all of that apart a little over the course of the chat, but let's start a little with the history. How and when did private prisons start in the US?
So the modern incarnation of private prisons really started in the 1980s with the craze of privatization generally in the United States. You see some previous attempts to privatize the justice system in the United States, but they were extremely sporadic and they never lasted long. The private involvement in incarceration in the United States has a long history. You can think of things like the Ithaca prison, where there were factories being operated by private parties inside of the government-run facility. This latest incarnation that started in the 80s is really its own beast, where you have a private corporation who builds and operates on a day-to-day basis with limited oversight from the actual public government, the entire facility. So that incarnation of private prisons started in the 80s. And if you look at some of the graphs about the number of people who are held in private facilities, it shoots up along with the drug war, right? As more people are incarcerated, there more and more people are being incarcerated in private facilities. The second sort of wrinkle to that is that as detention for immigration issues started to explode, the corporations that ran incarceration facilities saw a business opportunity there. And so they immediately got into the business of holding immigrant detainees. And so that's a more recent development, and that largely is driven by the government's increasing reliance on detention for immigration measures.
The ABA's involvement or kind of thinking about private prisons similarly kind of dates back to like the 1980s. Can you tell us a little bit about how the ABA first got involved in evaluating whether the use of private prisons was legitimate or appropriate?
Yeah. So as these new private facilities were growing up, I think people who were paying attention said, hey, this seems like a questionable issue. What should we do here? And so the ABA convened a task force and said, let's look into this. It was led by Ira Robbins, who was a professor at the time. He's worked with Abolish Private Prisons previously. He was an original board member. He wrote a report that was initially sort of published as a law review article and then adopted as a report along with a resolution in 1990. That one's 115B. And that resolution urged caution. It didn't go as far as to say that they shouldn't exist or that no government should get involved. It urged any entity that was going to consider these private facilities to be very cautious as they implemented it. And it said, let's check in later to see how it's developed, right? Let's see if the promises that the private parties are making are actually being borne out. Let's see if the constitutional issues get developed. And so that was sort of, I guess it's been, what, 35 years ago now, which seems like ancient history, but that was the initial ABA involvement. It said, let's be cautious, don't get involved with this without being very careful, and then let's see how it develops over the next time period.
So I guess that leads logically to the question, how did it develop? So what have we learned since then about how private prisons operate? Clearly, you all still have very grave concerns.
Yeah, I think the short answer is they operate terribly, right? And there's been a lot of recent academic attention being paid to these facilities. And so you see one study done by an economist, Professor Mukherjee, who found that private prisons in Mississippi, if you were to spend time in those facilities, you're going to spend approximately 8 to 10% longer than the similar kind of, somebody who was convicted for a similar kind of offense that was being held in a public facility, right? And this comes down to what I mentioned briefly earlier, to the disciplinary infractions being the main mechanism here. And so if you're in a private facility in Mississippi, you're much more likely to be written up for these disciplinary infractions. And over time, that added up to approximately 90 extra days on your sentence, which worked out to roughly 10% in that sample size. There's been a bunch of other sort of similar kinds of studies. One in the upper Midwest found that qualitatively, if you're in a private facility, you have less access to things like rehabilitation and education and other kinds of services. A district court judge in Arizona found that privatization of medical care, even in public facilities, was the cause that the state couldn't deliver constitutionally adequate medical care, right? And so you see all of these studies looking at, and even district court judges saying privatization is the root cause here. And then more recently in 2016, the Biden Department of Justice Inspector General did a report, and this was looking at Federal Bureau of Prisons versus what they call contract facilities, which is what we call private prisons, right? And they looked along, 20 plus different measurement areas and found that I forget exactly the number, but it's somewhere in the realm of like 21 out of the 27 measures that they looked at, the contract facilities ranked worse than the public facilities. And an example of those kinds of measurements that they were looking at are things like contraband, safety of the people who are incarcerated, safety of the workers, drugs and weapons that are getting in there where they're not supposed to be. So you can see how they looked at this broad spectrum of things and found that overall, these contract facilities were operating in a worse way. And so it's just every once in a while, I'll say in approximately like 5% of these kinds of broad efforts, you'll find a study that says that the private facilities are operating on the same level or better than the government run ones. But the vast majority of these efforts that have tried to determine which are operating better find that the private facilities operate much worse.
I believe it was actually the Obama administration. I'm sure that's what Rob meant.
Yes.
When that first occurred, to take just a step back for a second, think about what government has created with private prisons, because they are government created. Their only customers are the government, federal, state, county, city. And they operate just like any other industries that are institution-based. So whether you're a private hotel or resort, a hospital, a nursing home, the model fails if the beds are empty. And the same is true with private for-profit prisons. So we have not only created an industry that has a profit incentive to stay full and increase the size of its pie, but it then hires lobbyists to increase the size of its pie, whether it's through organizations like ALEC coming up with model legislation like 3 strikes and mandatory minimums, or spending time in state legislatures. So yes, they have a First Amendment right to petition the government, but the government has created these entities and these incentives, which then in turn turn into campaign cash for those in the legislatures and executives that are supporting them. So it's a cycle of money that's based on treating people as commodities.
Has that led the ABA to take a more recent position on whether there should be private prisons?
Yes. So more recently, the ABA said we've had all the evidence that we need, and Resolution 507, which I think was passed in 2021, said that the ABA no longer urges caution and that jurisdictions should no longer contract with these private facilities. We've had 35 years of experience at this point, and the experiment has, turned out to be a failure. And so Abolish Private Prisons worked with the ABA, drafted a report documenting, collecting a lot of the evidence that we've spoken briefly about here, and came out with a stronger resolution that just said, look, it's time to move away from this industry that's clearly not lived up to the promises that they've made.
And to be certain, Robbie and I came to the ABA Corrections Committee twice. Initially, we came to the ABA with a constitutional argument that we should not have private prisons. It was suggested we come back to the drawing board with a policy perspective. And so we initiated the petition process through the Corrections Committee of the Criminal Justice Section back in 2021.
Right. And I think that resolution and report should be in the materials for this chair chat. And I think CRSJ was a co-sponsor of that resolution. So that's wonderful. Have some jurisdictions stopped using private prisons?
Yeah, so about 20 states have never used private prisons. And then in the last decade or so, another about half dozen, I think it's 7 at this point, states have moved away from private prisons, whether that's, an amendment to the state constitution or just the legislature passing a law that says that the state warden or the State Department of Corrections, depending on how it's worded in each state, no longer has the ability to make these contracts with private facilities. So we have seen some momentum in the past, like I said, decade or so, away from private prisons from a handful of states that had used them previously. So there is a group of states that are moving away from it. And then along with that, there's some smaller jurisdictions from counties and municipalities. King County being one that stands out because John worked with King County in Seattle, the greater Seattle area, to stop their use of private jails. And so you see it at the state level. You also see it other forms of private detention at the local municipality level.
That's wonderful. Has that been motivated by some of the arguments you've made? Like, what is the motivation for that, largely, that you've seen work in the legislative or advocacy area?
I'd say that, you start with mass incarceration. Our country is, the numbers don't change much. We're 5% of the world's population, and 25% of the world's prisoners is the numbers that get used quite often. And of course, there are particular parts of our communities that get picked on in particular. People of color, immigrants, people with serious mental illnesses, people in poverty, homelessness. And so you had people that were pushing back against mass incarceration generally, and could see this industry as one of the forces that have an incentive to sustain mass incarceration, if not grow it. We can see what's happening with immigration detention now with our new administration, and the immediate impact, positive impact on the stock values of the private prison corporations. So I think that was part of it. The other part of it that Rob alluded to earlier, the moral question of creating a profit incentive to incarcerate and detain people, that has caused a number of mainstream faith organizations to come out with resolutions that also call for abolition. And one of the, which led us to actually engaging with a lawyer from Jerusalem who had successfully convinced the Israeli Supreme Court that prison privatization was a violation of human rights, and got the industry banned in that country. All of these kinds of things came together in considerations for new legislation and ordinances. Some examples: the King County Ordinance, Greater Seattle area, became a Washington state law in 2021, banning private prisons, jails, and immigration detention centers. In Tucson, Arizona, we have a city ordinance and a county ordinance that ban prison and jail privatization. So there are different levels. In Congress, in past years, Bernie Sanders in the Senate and Raul Grijalva of Tucson in the House have introduced what was called the Justice is Not for Sale Act, that, among other things, would have banned prison privatization nationally. But of course, those efforts.
Sorry, John. Yeah, I think it's been my experience that the people who get it on sort of moral, ethical grounds are the most eager to make these things go forward. And then you have a group of people who are the persuadables, who want to hear the economics behind it and want to see the efficacy of what's happening. And so there's different approaches to work with those different groups. And I think you just have to identify, is this person a true believer? Are they going to see are they immediately going to see the connection to slavery? Are they immediately going to see the sort of, ethical problems with having a person detained by somebody else? Or are they the kind of person that's going to say, show me the numbers, do these things work? How much is it going to cost us? And it's important to work with both of those groups, I think.
Can you maybe talk about the experience of one of the states that's moved away, or jurisdictions that's moved away from private prisons?
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things is before I get into one specific, I think it's extremely rare for a state that goes away from private prisons to then go back to private prisons. A couple of states have flirted with going back once they've gone away from it. But generally, once you make the move away, you sort of stay away. it's sort of difficult in our experience to find data about what's been going on after this switch happens because uh, it's a complex statistical problem, I think. And John and I are lawyers, and so we don't have a lot of the math. I took math for lawyers in law school, and that's as deep as I have ever gotten. So you need really to work with sophisticated academics who can unentangle what's going on here, right? Because when a state bans private prisons, the whole state gets rid of them, right? And so you lose some of the natural comparisons. We were lucky a couple summers ago to have an intern that worked with us who had a math background. And so they looked into Nevada specifically, who had recently passed their legislation to stop using private detention facilities. And so that intern looked, I think, about 8 different metrics, thinking about things like employment rates in counties where private facilities had previously existed, arrest rates, conviction rates, length of sentences, all of the kind of metrics that you would want to measure, and found that moving to a public facility, like getting rid of private facilities and only using public facilities, had a marginal effect on most of the things, and then there were some positive effects beginning to show up in things like length of detention and conviction rates and stuff like that. So, and the crime rate didn't change at all. So one of the things I think that people get scared about is if you get rid of private prisons, are you going to have to release people and then your crime rate goes up? And it turns out that all of the sort of scare tactic concerns, none of those panned out at all.
And one of the important lessons, for any state now using private prisons to consider if they're thinking about getting out of that business, they don't have to invent the wheel. It's been done. And they can look to Nevada is just one example. California is another. The federal government, under Biden, stopped contracting with private prisons through the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So they ended those contracts, not the contracts through the Marshal Service.
So how many people in the United States are currently in private prisons?
So yeah,
Go ahead.
the numbers change year by year, obviously day by day. In 2024, it's approximately 8%. That number has varied between 8 and 10 to 12% for as long as I've been working in this space. So it sits in the incarceration field. It sits right around 10%, plus or minus a couple. The immigration detention space is completely different. It used to be around 40%, and the recent numbers, it's over 90%. So over 90% of people that are in immigration detention facilities are being held in private facilities. And so that number has just skyrocketed. The incarceration number has held steady or even taken, a 1 or 2% dive over the past 6 to 7 years.
And go ahead, John.
I was just going to mention a couple of other broad brush dynamics. So, the number one priority of the private prison corporation, unlike the government, is profit. If the corporation is not making a profit, it has no reason to exist. And in fact, if the profits go down too much, they're starting to show red ink, the shareholders may sue the management, which is exactly what happened when the Department of Justice announced it was no longer going to use private prisons back in 2016. So that's one thing I wanted to mention. And Malia, I can't remember what the second thing was, so maybe I better wait till your next question.
I got one. Maybe this is.
I know what it was. I know what it was, Rob. Yeah, you know what it was too. So that 8% number generally refers to the states.
Mm-hmm.
The federal percentage, I've seen it as high as 17%, but that state number is an average. That includes the 20+ states where the number is 0.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be as high as 40% in states like Montana and New Mexico. Arizona, where I am, we're at about 29%.
Is that geographic? Is it more common, the higher percentages in the West? I'm just thinking about what you just said in terms of the cluster of states.
I don't know how far the Mason-Dixon line comes west, but I think you can find that the states in the Sunshine areas, east to west, are more heavily using private prisons.
The correlation between slave states and high users of private prisons is like a 1-to-1 correlation almost. It's like it's another indication of how this is just another incarnation of what the United States has been dealing with, since the 18th century.
That raises, if you don't mind, just one tangent. This was not a partisan issue until recent. You have a red state like Nebraska that has never used private prisons, and you have a bluer than blue state like Vermont that is sending men who are incarcerated down to a private prison in Mississippi. So it unfortunately has become partisan, but it shouldn't be, and it hasn't been.
One clarification, because I think like numbers are important in terms of volume, but I mean, we talked about 8 to 10% of the incarceration numbers. Am I right in thinking that's like 100,000 people?
Yeah, that's the right ballpark for sure.
I want to follow up on, John, you mentioned, I think, that President Biden signed an executive order to phase out the use of private prisons. And I know that didn't extend, perhaps as it ought to have, into the immigration space. But has the Federal Bureau of Prisons made progress?
They did. And the limitations of President Biden's order were, it did not apply to immigration at all. It did not apply to the states, who are the main users of private prisons. But he did require that the US Department of Justice stop using private prisons. Well, the Bureau of Prisons, which has its own facilities, did. Within 3 years, they were able to extricate themselves from all the contracts. Not so with the Marshal. The Marshal doesn't have its own facilities. And so not only were they unsuccessful in withdrawing from those contracts, but they started to do workarounds. They would contract with a local government, a town or a county, for pretrial detainees, and then that town or county would contract with a private prison to detain the people. So no, the Marshal was not successful.
And then, of course, one of the the large batch of executive orders that President Trump just recently signed included reversing that particular executive order, and directed the Bureau of Prisons to start using these private facilities again. And this is something that basically everybody expected, including the publicly traded corporation themselves. You see their stock price shot up after the election in November. And then most recently, in one of the quarterly earnings calls that any publicly traded corporation has to have with its shareholders, the CEO of one of the private prison corporations said, "In my years of being in this industry, this is the most excited and the most opportunistic that we've ever been in terms of expanding our business." So you can see that when it comes to these kinds of policy decisions that the president makes, right? When all you can do is do it through an executive order, that's just about the most easily switched when a new administration comes around. So we think it's important to make changes at a more systemic level, whether that's a court case in individual states or in the federal court system, whether that's passing legislation at the state and federal level, or whether that's working through the initiative and referendum process in whatever states have those available, to make sure that these kinds of decisions get taken out of the hands of people who are financially and politically motivated to continue and expand the use of private prisons.
So let me ask you to expand on that and just talk a little bit about how Abolish Private Prisons pushes jurisdictions to end the use of private prisons. I mean, Robert, you kind of rattled off some things you can do. Can you talk a little more in depth about different places in which those things have worked and how each of them sort of plays out?
Sure. I think so. At Abolish Private Prisons, we really see it as having 3 different legs, right? We have the education piece, which is foundational, and you have to do it all the time. And so that's number one, just telling people that private prisons exist. A lot of people who aren't paying close attention to the justice system that we have today may not know that private prisons exist, right? And so the first thing is saying, hey, these things are out there. Our experience has been, once we tell people that private prisons exist and explain what's going on, the gut reaction of people is that seems problematic. And so the next step of when we talk to people is saying, here's all the problems, right? And just here's some things that you can do as an individual to make some change, right? So that's the first prong and sort of the necessary prong. That's with individuals. John and I speak to basically any group that will let us in front of them for a half hour or an hour, everyone from faith groups to high schools and colleges and law schools, groups like the ABA. Basically, one and how we see it as a foundational issue for us is educating people on the existence and the problem of private prisons. So that's one. The second one is litigation. We have filed a case in Arizona District Court and federal court challenging the constitutionality of private prisons generally. That case got a bad decision from the Ninth Circuit, so now we're going back and following up in a different litigation strategy, building cases throughout the states. I think as anybody who's really been paying attention to the federal judiciary over the past 10 to 15 years has seen the opportunity to expand civil rights and civil justice in the federal courts seems to be diminishing, and state courts seem to be the refuge for people to say, you know, let's push the bounds here. Let's see how we can make justice fairer for people, right? And so the litigation is the second piece that includes federal and state court. And then the third piece is advocacy. And so that includes working with state and federal legislators to say, you know, here's what language looks like. We have some model legislation now from states like Washington and Nevada and California who've all approached it from similar but slightly different ways with different wrinkles. And so we have different examples to say, this is doable, this is what the language looks like, right? And then apart from the public sphere, we also think that you can have successful advocacy moving towards some of the private decision makers. And so that looks like working with groups like the ABA to say, let's divest from private prisons and strangle their funding, right? We use the divestment examples of firearms and tobacco and other kinds, and South Africa, apartheid, right? Where divestment has a very strong public appeal. And so we use those examples as sort of models to follow after and say, look, if you think that private prisons shouldn't exist, then certainly it doesn't make sense that your investment dollars are going towards private prisons. And so we're trying to work with fund managers right now to create easily accessible funds for people that, let's say you don't want to look that closely at your investment portfolio, but you don't want to be invested in private prisons. There should be easily accessible funds for you that are out there that might be, you know, the Russell minus prison profiteering or whatever that looks like, right? We also encourage individuals who have pensions, who have relationships with fund managers to say, can you please create a fund for me that looks like this, right? Work with if you're part of a union, right? Go to your HR rep and your whoever that is to say, let's use our force, right? Our union force to get 10,000 people to talk to this fund manager to say, let's create a prison-free fund for us, right? So there's some ways to put financial pressure on these corporations. And that's been some of the more exciting work that APP has done recently, I think.
Yeah, let's break up. Oh, I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
I was just gonna add, in that regard, even in the states that don't use private prisons, and in some of the states that ban private prisons, their pension funds are still invested in Geo Group and Core Civic through index funds. And you know, to Rob's point, what we'd like to see fund managers do and pensioners insist on is to get out of that kind of investing. We think there are particular considerations for lawyers and judges as well that go beyond just the policy considerations that other pensioners may have.
And there's a handful of jurisdictions that not only invest in index funds, but that directly own shares of Geo Group and Core Civic, the two publicly traded corporations. So it's not only the sort of slightly diffuse method through the index funds, it's also direct investment by owning equity in the companies. And then there's a sort of third way through private equity groups, right, that are not as diffuse as index funds, and they may directly invest through this private equity group into these corporations. And so there's a spectrum of how direct the investment is for these investment portfolios, everything from direct shares through equity groups and then into sort of more diffuse funds.
And how would someone know if their either personal portfolio, like maybe they're, someone who doesn't own individual stocks, but they own, ETFs, or they're invested, in their own, a lot of people use like target fund dates, right? How would you go about trying to understand whether either you personally or your union or your pension actually had some of this in their portfolio?
I think the first thing is, if you want to ask somebody else, if you're part of one of these organizations, you should be able to ask whoever's responsible for that. If it's through the HR group, or if BlackRock has a representative that you're in contact with or whatever, you should be able to ask them and say, what are we invested into in any way, right? Through the various methods that I mentioned earlier. Because I think the initial reaction sometimes, if you talk to somebody, is they'll look at the list and they'll say, we don't own any equity, individual shares in any of those groups. And so you're clear. But if you're going to talk to somebody, make sure that you ask them to take that second level look and say, are any of the funds that we're invested in owning equity, or are we using any equity groups that directly own parts of that company? The second way is, if you don't want to talk to somebody else, or you manage your own portfolio, there's a website called prisonfreefunds.org. And they exist primarily to tell people who are interested what they are invested in. And so you can go onto that website, you can type in the stock ticker of whatever fund you're looking at. You can also upload documents that have some fund information. They don't already, they've not already scanned every possible fund that exists in the world, right? Because that's an impossible task. So most of the big ones they already have information on. If they don't already have it, that's when you can upload more documents, and that can generate some information too. If they have the information for your fund, then it will generate a report that tells you, what stocks or bonds or whatever are being invested in private prisons, in border detention, or in more generalized like conflict kinds of groups. And it scores each investment, and it scores the funds and highlights the offenders from each category. So Prison Free Funds, if you're looking for an online tool that you can use yourself, it's something that we use and that we encourage people to use. APP doesn't run it, but it's something that we have used ourselves, and that, it gives good information.
John, I know that you came back to the ABA and asked them to support a resolution urging divestment. Do you want to talk a little bit about that and what the result was?
Yeah, so I had done some public records requests in Arizona, which is another way to get that kind of information about where the investments are. And through that, confirmed that the retirement pension plans of Arizona's police, prosecutors, legislators, judges, public defenders are all invested in CoreCivic and Geo Group. From that, what can we do with that? One of the things we did was we went back to the Corrections Committee, ran the idea past the membership during a meeting, and then Rob and I drafted the initial draft of the resolution and report. What was adopted wasn't that far off from where we went. And that was adopted by the House of Delegates just last August. What we'd like to see from this is the next step, which is with the ABA's membership in all the states. It would be so helpful if lawyers in each state would confirm, are their own pension plans and those of prosecutors, judges, public defenders, are they invested in these prison corporations? And if they are, work with us to see if we can undo that.
And I think that's that 2024 resolution is 518, and it will be in the materials for the chair chat as well. Has the divestment movement had an impact? Have you seen some successes?
So the two big groups that have already divested is the CalPERS, the giant California public employees retirement system, and then the New York City Comptroller's office, and have both moved away from private prisons in their investment. They've done it slightly differently because as soon as you get into the details of this, it can get a little iffy. What counts as some corporation that's involved in private prisons? So there's some details to work out. There's And you can see how two large jurisdictions have already done it. A nice thing about that is both the NYC Comptroller's Office and the CalPERS Pension Advisory Committee, I think it was called, produce reports, because one of the things about the pension management groups is they have a fiduciary duty to the members that are part of that to make sure that they're protecting the investment, right? And so if you're going to say we're going to make a policy change, you have to justify that and making sure that you're upholding your fiduciary duty. So both groups produce a report that said, look, here are the fiduciary reasons that we should be divesting from these groups apart and on top of the moral and ethical reasons, right? And so both groups pointed out the riskiness of these investments, how they can go up and down based on who's in charge, right? And you see these wild stock swings, how large public pressure campaigns can have negative effects on the equity price of these corporations. And so there is pure financial reasons to get out of these investments too. And sometimes those kinds of arguments can be more effective when you're going to talk to a fund manager because they have that fiduciary duty that they have to respect. And so the nice thing about California and New York City having done this is you've got great documentation. If you're interested in doing it, you can pull up those reports, take them to your fund manager, take them to your representative and say, look, we got to get out of these for the financial reasons as well as the moral and ethical ones.
That's wonderful. So last question really that I have, I assume hopefully that that ABA members will take up that charge and seek to find out whether they or their state pension systems are invested in private prisons. What else would you like ABA members to do to help to encourage jurisdictions to end their use of private prisons?
I would hope they would take a look at our work on our website, abolishprivateprisons.org, which has a lot of information. And of course, we are a 501c3 charity. We survive on donations. Those would be a couple of things. Rob, you were about to say something.
Yeah, I think it's sort of a spectrum of how involved you want to be, right? I mean, we're looking for everything from people who want to be counsel of record with us on local jurisdictions for litigation, behind the scenes partners to do research and writing. If you have connections in the state legislature that you can connect with, or you can put us in contact with, or if you just want to, do what John said and check your own stuff, right? So for me, I think if you're interested in more information, the needs of Abolish Private Prisons itself is always changing. You're looking at 100% of the staff on the screen right now. And so the easiest thing to do, reach out to one of us and say, hey, what do you guys need right now? To see what the sort of most pressing things are, because those change dramatically day to day, month to month. So I think, it's everything from get out there, be self-motivated, gather a group of people in your area to go make a change, all the way up to, hey, I'm totally swayed by you guys. Let's be partners and move forward, and everything in between.
Wonderful. Well, I want to thank you both. Thank you, John and Robert, for this engaging and thought-provoking discussion. Your insights not only deepen our understanding of private prisons, but also remind all of us about our ongoing commitment and the direct action needed to advance civil rights and social justice goals. I think John said this, but more about their work can be found at abolishprivateprisons.org. I want to thank everyone who joined us today. Thank you for being part of this dialogue, and I encourage you to stay engaged with the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section. Visit our website, explore upcoming events, and consider joining one of our committees that can help shape the work that we're doing. Maybe you can be part of the next step within the ABA. You can do that at ambar.org/CRSJ. So thank you to our speakers, to the team behind the scenes, and of course, all of you who made time to be here today. We look forward to seeing you at our next chair chat and continuing our vital civil rights work together.
Thank you, Malia.
Thank you.
Thank you.